Today in the EU, how Scholz's government stabilises despite European instability. Germany's domestic politics have recently stabilised after a turbulent spring. While Europe faces instability, Chancellor Olaf Scholz's coalition government in Germany has taken steps to solidify its position. What measures have been implemented, and how is Germany preparing to take on more responsibility amid potential challenges from the political instability in France and changes in NATO duties? Hello and welcome. I am Evi Chiori, and this is Today in the EU. To look into these pressing questions, we're joined by our Berlin-based politics reporter, Nick Alipour. Hi, Nick.
Hello.
Now, in Germany, domestic politics seem to have taken a shift. Just this past spring, things appeared quite unstable. What was the main issue back then?
Observers of German politics will remember that for the past year or so, the German government was sort of the definition of chaotic and a mess, to the extent that people now, whenever they hear traffic light coalition, which is the nickname that was given to the current coalition government, sort of evokes very negative emotions, and I think the coalition parties are aware of that. Yeah, the bone of contention, I do think there were lots of things obviously coming together. In part, obviously, there was a three-way coalition between partners that clash over certain issues quite intensely. But really where it started was a clash on a law on phasing out fossil fuel heating systems in private households. And, this whole thing is such a mess and so complex, and I think some people still try to wrap their mind around what went wrong there. So I'm not going to get into the detail. Point being, especially the Liberal FDP and the Greens disagreed on how to approach this. The FDP sort of thinking it was all too intrusive. And since then, things just went downhill. The coalition wouldn't stop fighting over everything from that law to the budget to how to fix a hole in the budget that came up because they couldn't agree on other things. So for the past year, really, the government was just entrenched in fighting for a long time.
Now, that phase seems to be in the past. What's the secret to this success?
I wouldn't exactly say it was entirely in the past, but it is true for sure that the government works now in it does seem a lot more, let's say, at least less noisy. So there's a lot less fighting that's taking place in public, even though there's still people who comment, I wish we would work in a more harmonious way and all that. Those comments are still being made, but it's no comparison to the past year. What has happened really is I think the parties realized that they went too far in sort of fighting in public and talking about everything they are unhappy with in the government in public. And I think about last autumn, last winter, they had some very serious get-togethers and heart-to-hearts where in the end now we're having a government that, while not really agreeing on things, they still don't always talk about that in public. So the last budget negotiations still went to the extent that there were rumors that the government could fail if the government wouldn't agree on a budget at a certain point in time.
Wir in Deutschland kommen da durch. Erinnern Sie sich, wo wir vor einem Jahr standen? 3, 4, 5% Wirtschaftseinbruch hatten uns viele Expertinnen und Experten vorausgesagt. Viele befürchteten, die Preise würden immer weiter steigen.
Olaf Scholz expressed back in January his confidence in Germany's resilience, recalling that the previous year experts predicted a significant economic turndown and many feared ongoing price increases and heating issues, something that would have harmed the coalition government, but things ended up turning out differently for Germany.
With a lot of trouble and a lot of effort, they actually managed to get there. And in between, there was no public fighting because they would always refuse to comment on what was going on behind the scenes. And that definitely is an improvement.
And in Europe, things appear to be quite hectic still, especially in France and the Netherlands. Why do things seem so unstable now in comparison to what's happening in Germany?
It's funny enough that the German government, which was sort of the definition of a lack of stability, now appears like a really well-working, well-oiled machine in comparison to what's going on in France. The Netherlands obviously has a new government now, so let's see what's happening there. But obviously, both France and the Netherlands are grappling with the rise of the far right, which doesn't really lend itself to coalition building and cooperation to the extent that the parties of the center or the absolute majorities that were known in France do. So at the moment, France, basically the most important partner in the EU for Germany, is after the snap election, which led to, unclear majorities, meaning France currently doesn't really have a government until it's being formed and nobody knows how. Ever since France is just inward looking. So that's one problem here. And I would also like to highlight, obviously, it's not just the EU, it's also the US, because US is the most important partner for Germany in the world and could possibly see Donald Trump come back into the office of the president, which would also be a massive problem for Germany.
And how is the EU or the country's main allies are viewing Germany right now? What's the dynamic of these relationships?
Within the EU and at the world stage, Germany is currently being left alone by its most important partners. And obviously the other thing, and that's more Europe than the EU, is that now, while the Netherlands, for example, are TBD in terms of how stable they will be with their new sort of like right-wing government, and France is inward looking, what has happened now is that Germany's government looks relatively stable, comparatively stable, but now there's also the United Kingdom, which had an election. And you have a Labour government, which has an overwhelming majority. So weirdly, the UK is now sort of the beacon of stability within Europe. And I think Germany has realized, and especially German lawmakers from the SPD, so that's the party of Chancellor Olaf Scholz, which is a socialist, social democratic party, is now looking to its sister party, Labour, in the UK for fostering defence ties. They want to sort of create a new defence security agreement. And the UK will become, now that the government is also a lot more pro-European than the previous one, will become an important partner to foster stability within Europe alongside Olaf Scholz's avowed attempts to be a coalition builder and take more responsibility for Europe's own defence.
And how and why is Germany preparing to take on more responsibilities to compensate for the uncertainty, if not problems, caused by the political instability in France and the potential withdrawal of the US from the NATO alliance?
So what comes in handy is that Germany has already started to adjust to a new world reality since Russia's invasion. So it has worked on becoming more self-reliant in terms of its hard power, in particular its defense. Zeitenwende, turn of the times, that's the term that Germany, the Chancellor, has coined for that. So rebuilding the military, using a lot more money to rebuild the military. But as far as we can see, that's obviously still far from enough because Germany has, we're talking about the United States here, the most powerful country in the world, both in terms of defense and any other economic sense. In the short term, it won't be possible to replace the United States in terms of its defense and as a trading partner. But Germany is sort of, from what I'm understanding and what politicians have been briefing in the media, is trying to prepare for the case of the US withdrawing under potential President Donald Trump by building ties with Republicans. At the moment, the government is relatively close to the Democrats, but, for example, the transatlantic coordinator of the German government has been in touch with lots of forces in the US that are on the right, the governors, lawmakers from both houses, to make sure that even if it transitions to a far right-wing government, there will still be enough connections to keep things going. So that's definitely one thing, keeping the ties with the US going. The other thing inside the EU is that Germany will now sort of have to replace a very important partner in France, potentially. And the Chancellor would like to see himself strengthened in his role as a coalition builder. So someone who tries to foster majorities outside the traditional alliance with France. And that is sort of, I think, the role that Germany sees itself in.
Remaining on an EU level now, Europe is trying to turn more to security and defense and do more on this. And Germany has been playing a crucial role on the decision-making level regarding this. Do you see its influence remaining the same, or do you see it shifting?
The best chance that Germany has is keeping the US going in some way. And I think that's what they're trying as well. I would also put into question how helpful Germany can be to foster consensus and build majorities at the EU level, because it's often Germany itself that is blocking that. Often Germany is the odd one out, for example, on delivering long-range missiles to Ukraine. In terms of military aid to Ukraine, I think Germany tried to get a discount. Germany also tried to avoid taking on new common EU debt, which some countries like France, for example, are really pushing for. So Germany is often the odd one out, also because within its own coalition, it's not always agreeing on EU policy. So to which extent Germany can really help fostering majorities, that is to be seen. I think there is some hope for its role within the EU if we remember what happened in the first Trump term, when all of a sudden Europe noticed that it had to sort of like pull together and pull its weight in matters of defense. And all of a sudden, Germany and France came up with those massive flagship defense projects, such as the new tank that they want to build, MGCS, and the new fighter jet that they want to build, FCAS. That was an indirect consequence of seeing that Europe has to finally come and account for its own defense. But to be actually a global actor, to actually pull its weight as the, third largest economy, Germany would have to move into regions such as the Indo-Pacific, where it's currently not at all present as an actor in terms of defense or other sort of foreign policy weight. So at the middling level of the EU, it can possibly lead to some movement and some sort of like new German power. At the world level, Germany will only matter, I think, as part of the EU.
And the current government is a coalition government led by Chancellor Olaf Scholz. What measures is he taking to solidify this stability, especially because you already mentioned that the allies and partners are sort of leaving Germany alone?
It would be too much to say that there's stability, but at least Germany has a long history of like coalition governments and adversarial forces working together. So I think the role that Olaf Scholz is currently taking is that, or that he would like to see himself in, is that of a moderator who is trying to keep Germany going and take compromises even when it's painful. So that's one thing. The second thing, which I think is really important and which Olaf Scholz has been highlighting a lot on the global stage, is Germany wants to, quote unquote, live up to its responsibility as a big country, as a big economy on the world stage as well, given that its most important partners in foreign policy, France and the United States, are facing this domestic weakness.
It's clear that it's not all rosy, because we've also had significant drama internally regarding far-right parties, which was also reflected on an EU level before and after the European elections with the reshuffling of the far-right. What's the situation in Germany right now regarding this topic?
What we can say is that the vote share of the far-right reached a record national high at the European elections. So that was obviously a rather dramatic situation. It hasn't really waned since. And what is, I think, worrying many people is the fact that the far-right is now also ahead in 3 regional elections, which are taking place in Germany in the autumn, in eastern Germany, which is a stronghold of the far-right AfD party. So there is a risk. And, what's also interesting is that the government parties have vote shares collectively below 10% in some of those states. So that people are afraid that we will see destabilizing majorities after those regional elections, which could plunge 3 Eastern German states into chaos, with the far right coming out on top and the other parties being left having to sort of sort out majorities around the far right. That will be a big challenge.
So then what action is the German government taking in response to the potential rise of the far-right governments?
I'm not sure entirely that things are in the hand of the government to change anything, because obviously the voters vote who they want to vote for. But what they are certainly doing, the German government, is they have been very well aware of the sort of underbelly of far-right activities that could potentially, promote far-right parties and their voting results, as well as undermine democracy and the rule of law once the far-right comes into power. And it looks like at the moment, so the most recent thing obviously that happened on Tuesday is that Germany has decided to ring-fence its constitutional court. So in case that the far-right would gain significantly in terms of its vote share, that Germany's sort of most important institution regarding the protection of the rule of law is protected against interference, as we have seen it in Poland and Hungary, to avoid further destabilization. So they sort of increased the obstacles towards the far-right potentially making any changes to it, or being able to block it if it comes to a certain amount of votes and certain amounts of seats in parliament. That would have been possible. Now they try to sort of find solutions so that the court can still work, even with the far right being more powerful than it is now.
Thank you very much, Nick. I am Evi Chiori, and this was Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news If you haven't subscribed yet, you can find us on all streaming platforms. You can get in touch with us by leaving a comment or a review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Your reviews help us a lot to spread the word about our work, but also understand what topics you like listening to. This episode was produced by Miriam Sáenz de Tejada, Nicoleta Yonta, and me. Thank you for tuning in, and until tomorrow morning. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.